On New Year's Eve in 1977, the American president raised a crystal glass at a state banquet in Tehran and declared Iran an island of stability. His host's empire seemed invincible. It boasted the fifth largest army in the world, a booming economy fueled by record-high oil prices, and an iron-fisted secret police force that suffocated dissent. 14 months later, the monarch had fled. The armed forces surrendered. The island of stability burned to the ground. The fall of the Iranian crown was not a slow decline. It was a sudden, violent implosion. It was not achieved by a foreign invasion or a military coup. It was dismantled, piece by piece, by the withdrawal of everyday citizens. This is the anatomy of that collapse, how a modern, heavily armed petro-state was brought to a halt from the ground up. But to understand how quickly the nation fractured, you first have to look at the blinding wealth that preceded it. In the early 1970s, the global oil prices skyrocketed, flooding the Iranian treasury. The regime weaponized this capital to force aggressive, top-down modernization, aiming to project the image of a progressive, untouchable global power. North Tehran became the epicenter of this prosperity. Boulevards were lined with boutiques importing European fashion. Citizens drove imported Cadillacs on sprawling new concrete highways. The government pursued billion-dollar contracts for nuclear power plants and modern megamalls. But this glittering facade was a heavily insulated bubble, and it actively locked out the majority of the population. Just a few miles south of those luxury districts, the sudden influx of cash had triggered crippling inflation. Rural farmers, displaced by aggressive state agricultural reforms, flooded into the capital, constructing vast, unsanitary shantytowns out of scrap metal and brick. More dangerously, the economic strategy alienated the bazaris, the traditional merchant class. For centuries, these sprawling market networks formed the financial backbone of the working class and maintained deep generational ties to Islamic clerics. As the government awarded lucrative monopolies to foreign corporations, the bazaris watched their domestic supply chains and livelihoods evaporate. By attempting to bypass the traditional economy, the state unknowingly backed a highly organized merchant class and a vast, disenfranchised underclass into the exact same corner. Yet, cornering a population does not automatically spark a rebellion, not when those people are paralyzed by fear. Economic disparity alone rarely triggers a revolution if the state maintains total control, which Iran did through SAVAK, a brutal security apparatus. SAVAK's network of informants permeated university lecture halls, factory floors, and government offices. By violently crushing secular political opposition, banning independent newspapers, and outlawing labor unions, the authorities eliminated every traditional avenue for public grievance. Dissidents simply disappeared from their workplaces. The resulting paranoia kept the public in a state of frozen compliance. However, because moving against the religious establishment directly was deemed too risky, the mosque remained the only viable space in the country where assembly could occur. When a regime controls the television networks, the newspapers, and the streets, a rebellion requires an alternative infrastructure. For Iran, that alternative was magnetic tape. Ayatollah Khomeini, exiled in France, utilized international telephone lines to transmit his fierce anti-monarchy sermons into the country. The distribution relied on an extensive, decentralized underground network. In damp basements and the back rooms of bazaars, dissidents daisy-chained cheap cassette recorders together to mass-produce copies of the speeches. These plastic cassettes were easily concealed, quickly duplicated, and impossible for SAVAK to fully eradicate. They bypassed the state media apparatus entirely, carrying the ideological spark directly into the living rooms of the working class. It was only a matter of time before that quiet indoor spark caught oxygen. When the street protests finally ignited, they did not explode all at once. They escalated through a brutal mathematical rhythm rooted in Shia Islamic tradition. Following a death, custom dictates a 40-day mourning period. In January 1978, Security forces fired on a group of protesting theology students, resulting in several fatalities. 40 days later, citizens gathered in multiple cities to hold memorial services. The military, attempting to disperse these crowds, fired again, creating new casualties. This established a relentless, ticking clock. Every 40 days, exponentially larger gatherings formed to mourn the new dead. But the government's reliance on lethal force fed directly into the organizational structure of the uprising, swelling the crowds from thousands into an unmanageable wave of humanity. The definitive fracture occurred on September 8th, a date recorded as Black Friday. In a desperate bid to reassert order, the monarch declared strict martial law. Tens of thousands of citizens, many unaware of the sudden decree, gathered in Tehran's Jaleh Square. The regime's response was uncompromising. The army deployed chieftain tanks and helicopter gunships into the dense urban center. Soldiers blocked the exits and opened fire on the trapped crowd with heavy machine guns. The resulting massacre left the asphalt soaked in blood and littered with abandoned shoes. Black Friday eradicated any remaining moderate voices within the opposition. It proved to the Iranian public that the Crown viewed them as an enemy combatant force, rendering peaceful reconciliation impossible. With the streets now designated as a lethal combat zone, the people changed their strategy. The protests provided the visual spectacle, but the actual dismantling of the government was executed through total economic paralysis. In the autumn of 1978, the working class simply withdrew their labor. Oil refinery workers initiated a nationwide strike, instantly severing the billions of dollars funding the military. This triggered a cascade of institutional failures. Our postal workers abandoned the mailrooms. Bank clerks locked the financial vaults. Customs officials walked away from the shipping docks, leaving essential imports rotting in cargo containers. Iran possessed one of the best-equipped armies in the Middle East, but tanks cannot run without domestic fuel, and soldiers cannot be paid without functioning banks. The infrastructure of the nation froze solid. This total withdrawal of labor forced the civilian population into severe hardship. The oil strikes triggered the collapse of the national power grid, plunging major cities into rolling blackouts. During a bitter winter, families stood in freezing, mile-long lines simply to secure a gallon of kerosene for cooking and heating. As state police retreated to their barracks to avoid the mobs, civic order dissolved. Neighborhoods quickly organized civilian committees, barricading their streets with burning tires and standing guard with hunting rifles to protect against looting. The government had ceased to function in any meaningful capacity. But a state cannot exist as a frozen monument forever. By January 1979, the internal pressure shattered the hollowed-out regime completely. The Shah abandoned the country, leaving behind a provisional government that existed in name only. When Ayatollah Khomeini returned in February, the takeover of the state was swift. Millions of citizens flooded the streets, overwhelming the remaining military installations through sheer numbers. The armed forces, unpaid and demoralized, officially declared neutrality. The monarchical order evaporated. The collapse of the old regime immediately triggered a ruthless power struggle. The uprising had been fought by a highly diverse coalition of Marxist students, secular intellectuals, labor unions, and religious clerics. However, the clerics possessed the most disciplined organizational network and moved with terrifying speed to fill the vacuum. Former generals were subjected to summary rooftop executions. Cinemas were burned. The new religious authorities moved immediately to consolidate their grip, violently purging the secular and leftist factions that had fought alongside them on the barricades. The definitive proof of this betrayal occurred in March 1979. Realizing the new theocratic government intended to mandate strict hijab laws and roll back decades of civil liberties, tens of thousands of Iranian women poured back outdoors on International Women's Day. Nurses, students, and professionals marched through the freezing snow without headscarves. They directly confronted the newly formed, heavily armed religious militias who threatened them with clubs. It was a desperate, courageous stand for the diverse, a secular vision of the revolution, a vision that was being methodically erased by the new architects of the state. That swift erasure is the defining tragedy of 1979. The Iranian Revolution remains a stark masterclass in the speed of institutional collapse. It demonstrates that the survival of a state relies entirely on the daily cooperation of its people. All the military hardware and oil wealth in the world cannot sustain a government once the working class decides to stop turning the gears. Yet it also serves as a dark historical warning regarding the mechanics of a power vacuum. The diverse coalition of citizens who bled to dismantle a dictator watched their analog uprising be swiftly co-opted by a new, unyielding authority. In the span of a single, violent winter, the entire cultural and political landscape of a nation was completely rewritten.